Idaho Matters is brought to you in part by St. Luke's Pharmacy, now offering free home delivery. For daily medications or one time prescriptions, home delivery is easy to set up. It's convenient and safe. St. Luke's Pharmacy, now delivering to your doorstep. Information on how to get started at stlukesonline.org.
Love Boise State Public Radio podcasts? They are free to enjoy, but not free to produce. If you can give, your support helps keep shows like Idaho Matters and Scandalize available to everyone. Donate now at boisestatepublicradio.org.
More Idaho Matters now from the studios of Boise State Public Radio News. I'm Gemma Gaudette. Liz Ortenberger has spent more than 2 decades working on the front lines of domestic and sexual violence. And she's challenging some of the most deeply held assumptions about how we respond to it. As CEO of SafeNest, which is Nevada's largest and most comprehensive nonprofit that addresses domestic violence, she oversees a broad continuum of services from emergency shelter and legal advocacy to prevention education and offender intervention. But her work goes beyond just services. Ortenberger argues that a system focused primarily on punishment after the fact is actually failing survivors, and that real safety requires addressing root causes, from trauma and addiction to cultural norms around power and control. Now, her perspective comes at a time when the data hits close to home. Here in Idaho, nearly a third of all crimes against persons are related to intimate partner violence, and many survivors never interact with law enforcement at all. And with the future of federal funding through the Violence Against Women Act uncertain after 2027, questions about what's working and what isn't, well, in Liz's opinion, they're more urgent than ever. And she's joining us now to talk more. Liz, really nice to have you on the program. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Yes, thank you for having me.
So, Liz, can you first explain what SafeNest is, how it got started, what your mission is?
Yeah, so SafeNest's mission is ending domestic and sexual violence. We largely serve primarily Clark County, Nevada, which is the home of Las Vegas. And we work in prevention, protection, and empowerment. But interestingly, we work with abusive partners, survivors that are affected, and children that are affected by domestic violence. So we serve the entire continuum.
So with that said, do you think that the way we focus, in particular when it comes to being tough on crime, is potentially missing the bigger picture when it comes to domestic violence?
Yes. So, we passed the Omnibus Crime Bill under Bill Clinton in 1996, which is really where Violence Against Women's Act began. And the heavy incarceration rates related to domestic violence sort of hit a exponential growth, right? And here we are today, almost 30 years later, sitting here going, wait a second, domestic violence rates aren't going down. Homicides against women aren't going down. The domestic violence space in general is not safer for communities or law enforcement or survivors. So what does failure look like? Kind of feels it looks like that, right? We've used the incarceration system as the sole sort of hammer in our space, and yet we are not seeing any of the changes that we would hope.
So when you talk about this idea, how different is it? And I'm talking about the idea of how does a survivor feel safer? How different is that from how success is normally measured?
Right. So backing up just a little bit, right? So understanding that domestic violence is not this monolith of like one type of crime. The realities are when an abusive partner behaves in different ways, there are different levers of whether or not that survivor is escalating towards homicide, in danger of further abuse, or what exactly is happening, right? So the legal system far and away has no way to dissect all of that and understand what abuse looks like on a larger spectrum versus just an initial instrument of abuse, right? So when we, and I want to shout out to my, colleagues in the space who back in the 1990s and even the 70s and 80s, really women that were diverse, that were in marginalized populations were saying, hang on, white feminist movement, this incarceration piece that you're working towards in domestic violence does not work in my community. It does not work in the relationships that I'm seeing. It doesn't work largely in spaces where the dynamics are different. But yet,
Mm-hmm.
as we are seeing so often now come out from that work of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, is finally an ability to say, sort of in this post George Floyd era, did we make a mistake? Right? Did we push an avenue of criminalization too hard, haven't seen the results, and really have disproportionately affected low income and marginalized survivors in a way that was unintended?
So let's talk about this piece then about a survivor feeling, safer.
Right.
That
So
seems to be such a different approach, right? Than
yeah.
how we've traditionally thought about this. So tell us what you mean by that. And then from your standpoint, how success is measured in those terms.
Absolutely. So when we look at the domestic violence criminal complex, right, we rob survivors of voice in the space from moment one. If you're in a state, which Idaho is, Nevada is, that has mandatory arrest policies for domestic violence, doesn't matter what the survivor is saying on scene, their voice is erased. It's up to law enforcement to make the decision. The same is then true in no drop prosecutions, where the survivor again has little voice to usually no voice. The district attorney's office is going to move forward with criminal prosecution because you're in a no drop state, right? So we've robbed
Mm-hmm.
survivors throughout this process of having voice. And we're not achieving the number one thing. What survivors want from the system, and we know this from peer-reviewed studies that not only we've engaged in with our population, but that have been done across the country, the first thing that survivors want is they want the violence to stop. The second thing they want is they want to be believed. And unfortunately, in mandatory arrest and no drop prosecution, there really isn't a mechanism for the violence to stop, nor is there a mechanism for them to be believed. Nevada is a jury state, so if the criminal prosecutions are moving forward, if there's going to be a conviction of a crime, it's going to include a jury. These are all spaces in which we just make survivors feel less believed, their voice doesn't matter, and then we wonder why they recant or no show. So my thought process on what we do with our survivors is we're not actually worried about whether or not you got what you wanted from the justice system, because that is so multifaceted. What we really want to know is whether this abusive partner went through treatment, whatever the dynamic is, do you feel safer in your relationship?
Mm.
And the levers that push on that are not the levers society usually thinks, which is punishment for the abuser. It's more like, do I have financial independence? Can I make decisions freely and clearly from my abuser? And then for those folks that are in situations where we're escalating towards lethality, have I left that relationship and I am safe today, and he does not have or she does not have any contact with me?
So how do you go about really changing these cultural norms? And what I mean by that is, you bring up this idea of belief, right? But once a victim gets into the legal system, all of a sudden it's, you don't know what's good for you. The legal system
Right.
knows what's good for you.
Right.
So, right? So even if there is a victim that might be saying, look, I recognize what's going on, but what if the abuser is the sole breadwinner? What if they have children, right? There are all of these questions. And at least here in Idaho, a lot of times what happens is there's a no contact order put in place right away, right? So all of a sudden you lose that income, you lose that stability. Right
Yep.
or wrong, that has a massive impact on your life, on your children's life, etc. So am I thinking of this? I guess in a way that would move the needle, that we need to be listening to these victims, survivors, but how do you change what has become so ingrained within our culture?
Right. Yeah. So I think we're at a really important point in the anti-domestic violence movement, which is, are the leaders of this movement ready to embrace something different, right? And what does that look like? So in Clark County, Nevada, there are about 100,000 domestic violence 911 calls every year, but only 25% of those result in an arrest. So we have this huge portion of households where violence was enough that somebody called 911, but there was no probable cause when police got there. That is your low-hanging fruit. Those are the households that agencies like mine and those across the region should be reaching out to and saying, how can we help get either counseling, couples counseling? What are all of the things that can be added to that household, right? Like, are they looking at eviction? What are the stress levers? What are the things that can happen? So there's a huge prevention piece to this that we largely miss, right? We wait for there to be a violent incident such that there's an arrest, and then we all react to the arrest. If we can get preventative, so from the start, kids in schools, couples that have had a 911 call but not an arrest made, that body of prevention work, it can be so valuable, because then what happens is these highly lethal domestic violence cases where there's a gun in the home and there's strangulation occurring, the sort of the red flag markers, these can be the cases that progress through the criminal legal system. And then we are really getting a dangerous perpetrator off the street. But what the legal system is not yet caught up to is mutual combat, bidirectional violence, all of these other forms of things that can happen between intimate partners or family members that fall under this large umbrella of domestic violence, but don't necessarily have the lethality markers. That's a family that needs some help. We need to figure out how to navigate conflict in the home. We need to be able to do some things differently. And we need to hold folks accountable to how they're doing that, which can happen outside of the criminal legal system. Leave the criminal legal system. Yeah, sorry.
I was going to say, you've actually talked about engaging people in prevention,
Yes.
men and boys in prevention. But we should also note, I think it's fair to say that we do know that abuse can go both ways, right? I mean, yes, the majority of victims are female. There are men that are victims too, and I think we need to note that. But what does that look like in practice then when we engage more people in understanding what prevention would look like before it escalates to what you were just talking about?
Absolutely, right. So what that looks like is, honestly, your folks that are most prone to repeat the cycles of violence are kids growing up in households where there's violence. So we know who these kids are for the most part. But schools can play such a huge role in having anti-violence education as it relates to relationships. Doesn't have to be an intimate relationship, but relationships in general, right? It's not okay to hit. But hitting is like, the physical abuse is sort of what everybody gets, but there's also this psychological abuse that we don't talk to young people about at all, right? Like, what does psychological abuse look like? And so, they're growing up in these environments where they're navigating bullies. They may also be bullies. All of these things are happening, but no one's unpacking this for them. And who is providing for young people, particularly young people in violent households, what a pathway forward can look like without violence in your life, and why that is a better choice? Because this is also what we don't talk about. Being violent, treating people in a certain way is a choice. But we raise young boys and really men to believe, right, you've got to be in control. You've got to have all these things. This is what an alpha male looks like. We have got to reframe that, because for one thing, women are very independent these days. Like, our independence scores are much higher than they were. So we're able to make a lot more choices for ourselves than we were even 20, 30 years ago. And what we're seeing, the other side of this coin, right, is we're seeing all of these disenfranchised young men who can't find a partner, are dropping out of college, are sort of going, what has society got for me? A huge part of this is, who's having these conversations with young men about how do you bring value to a relationship of equals? We talk, right? Young men are raised in this idea of I need to be the protector. I need to be the breadwinner. This is how my masculinity is attached to this. But yet, how do we say, no, you're coming in as equal? What does that look like? What does it look like to elevate a partner, right? And for the couple to be better together. And this is a contextually changing conversation that young men are not prepared for, because it's not happening broad scale, right? It may be, it's certainly probably happening in some households, But there is a change in what masculinity looks like from even 10 years ago, from prior, Me Too movement, that we're not preparing our young men for. And so an outcome of that is this disenfranchisement we're seeing in the space.
I know that some of your work also brings in things like culture and
Mhm.
parenting. And I would say what you just described about men and boys, that is cultural. And
Mhm.
it is something that I'm a mother to boys, and I see it in almost every narrative that is thrown their way. Yes, I'm seeing change, but you know, you have to start that change in the home. But if people
Mhm.
don't have the tools, how do you do that? I mean, how do you even start the discussion? Because if people haven't been, if parents haven't been exposed to that, we can't
Yeah.
expect them to know how to teach it.
Right, right. Yes. And so this is sort of that, like, how do we help? There's a ton of information coming out now about, boys are getting left behind, young men are
Mhm.
disenfranchised. The most powerful sort of conversation we can have around the dinner table is, how has the world changed from 20 years ago? And so what does that take? A tiny bit of research, but it's really just a conversation. And how do we help our young men elevate in a different way, right? Then I think about what, I'm 50. I think about what the men in my life learned when we were young, what that looked like, and sort of women were we were getting there to independence, but today women are much more likely to, single women are the fastest buying home buyers in the country, right? Women are finding this independence, and men, I think, are not coming along at the same speed, and so they're feeling like there isn't a world for me anymore. The patriarchy is dead, right? If hearing all
Mhm.
that kind of language. So as a mom also to a 16-year-old boy, what I talk about a lot at home is like, well, how do you come beside somebody, right? Like, think about a buddy, like a boy friend that you have, or like when we watch movies together, we talk about, like, hey, what does that look like any movie where the guys are walking away from an explosion. You can have that conversation afterward, like, did you feel like the men in that movie reflect men in your life, and how could he have
Mm.
elevated differently? Or just diving into these conversations. You don't always know where they're going to go, but I think young men are feeling very attacked, and some of that is fair. But how do they elevate out of that? It's not going to be by being victimized by the environment they're in. It's going to be by understanding the world dynamic is changing. Gender dynamics are changing in a way that we're much more designed to be in this. It's certainly in this current American context, we're equal, and that can look different. And even asking your son, hey, what would it be like if you had a partner or girlfriend that you were really close with, that you wanted to marry, and she was making more money than you? How would you feel about that? How would you feel about
Mhm.
staying home with the kids? These are just conversational points that the boys are trying to navigate with very little direction. So just opening up the conversation is going to be leaps and bounds ahead of where we are today.
So, do you see this moment as, I guess, more of a warning sign and or an opportunity to start rethinking and reshaping the system and even society?
Yeah, I think we're at a point where we need to have some systematic change related directly to domestic violence, as a sort of the criminal legal system being the only avenue to navigate that. Because to your earlier point, if I am financially dependent on my spouse or intimate partner, and they are abusing me, or I'm undocumented and they're abusing me, or pick your scenario, and I
Hmm.
want to stay in that relationship, or my faith is one that we're married and we stay together and we have children together. How can we create avenues that are not shaming and blaming to help people navigate abuse? And that really has never been the space the anti-domestic violence movement has encompassed. We've always been sort of on the survivor side, and anything short of leaving your abusive partner is failure. I think it's time for the anti-domestic violence movement to pick a new path in terms of, how do we create pathways that work for the survivors, So that's one element. The other element is, yes, I think there's a huge part of all of the stress that we're all feeling in society right now, of this changing dynamic of female independence, female wealth, female financial literacy, all these things. And I think boys aren't seeing a space for themselves in the same way they have the generations before us. So elevating the boys in our lives to understand how they fit into this new dynamic, or how do they want to fit into this new dynamic, is going to be a really important part of just overall health of our society.
I have about a little less than 2 minutes left with you, and I'd like to leave on this note. What can the average person, in your opinion, just do in their day-to-day lives to start making these changes? Because we can't just leave it up to, the system to make the changes.
Yeah. Yeah, great question. So if you're in a workplace, I think bringing in folks to talk about domestic violence is important. I think, this is domestic violence up until 1977 was still happening. It was just a private matter. It became a public matter in 1977. So what are the pathways that a survivor has to find support in your world? But also mentoring young men, just being involved, like whether if you're a dad, young men need to see positive, healthy men in their lives. Young women do as well, but when we look at like data from Boys and Girls or Big Brothers Big Sisters, girls are mentored far outweigh, like female mentors come forward for girls in a different way that men aren't showing up for boys. So if you're a man out there, getting involved with Boys and Girls Club, Boy Scouts, or any of these programs where you can elevate young men, I think that's desperately in need right now, and elevating them to understand that what they're seeing on YouTube, what they're seeing in pornography, what they're seeing in Hollywood is not the world in which reality is based, but providing really solid male role models that can help elevate young men is going to be a big win for everybody.
Well, I want to thank you so much for this conversation. Really appreciate it. We've been speaking with Liz Ortenberger. She is CEO of Safe Nest, and we've been talking about challenging some of the most deeply held assumptions that we have regarding domestic violence and prevention. And that'll do it for this episode of Idaho Matters. Make sure you check out our podcast feed, because you can find more episodes of topics that might be interesting to you. And for more local news and headlines, make sure you subscribe to the Connector podcast. Just by listening, you're helping to support public radio right here in Idaho. And I want to say a big thank you for that.
If you like podcasts like this, explore more from the Boise State Public Radio podcast family. There you'll find a mix of daily news, Idaho Voices, and in-depth series on a wide range of topics. I'm talking wild horses, political scandals, sustainable ranching, and militia groups in a post-January 6th world. Wherever you get your podcasts, just search Boise State Public Radio to find what Idaho's NPR station has in store for you.